design principles. So I think a lot of software developers think that design is completely an art form, right? That there are no rules and it can never be understood. And, some people are just brilliant designers. Well, that's not true. Design has a lot of very simple rules. And, good designers follow those rules. And if you just learn these rules or design principles, you are well on your way to becoming at least a decent designer, okay designer. And also, if you know the rules, then when you see a bad design, they'll help you understand why it's bad, because we also can often just look at an app or something and realize, well, this is not good, but we can't really pinpoint why it's not good. So learning about these design principles will help you do that. And then once you know exactly what the problem is, now you can fix it. So these come from this book here. Most of them come from this book. So you might want to check it out. And the book has more stuff that I'm not talking about here. But so you might want to check out that book. Or you can also check out these two websites, patterns.com and the pattern library at down there, wheelie.com/patterns. These are just, and you can just Google for user interface design patterns. There's a lot of websites that will list UI design patterns. These are, general ideas about how to do user interfaces, how to use different parts, and when do you want to use an accordion versus a list versus a drop down, etc. So first thing is color. I think I have a lot of developers that just don't know about colors and then just start putting in colors and putting a new color and a new color and a new color, and you end up with stuff like this right here. That is not what you want, right? You want to use a color palette, right? So whenever you build an app, one of the early things you do in your design is to pick a color palette, pick a set of colors that will work well together. So here's a website with a color palette. You see they're using sort of the same shapes, same tones, and so it looks a lot better than this. And how do you pick colors? Well, there's this thing called the color wheel that's been around for centuries. And the color wheel helps you pick a color. So it's just a wheel like this, and you can just Google for it. There's tons of websites and apps that implement the color wheel. So just look for color wheel. And so the colors are put in this way, and it just turns out that you can, if you pick a color in the color wheel, the color opposite that color wheel is a really good highlight color for that one. So red and green, they go well against each other as well. You can use green to highlight on a red, or you can use red as a highlight on top of green. You can then, if you want colors that go well together as a whole, you can pick colors in a triangle, or what they call here a triad. So any three colors in any triangle, so you can just move this triangle around. Any three colors in a triangle go well together. And similarly, for these tetrad or four colors, you can have those four colors. You can move these around until you find the four that you want, and those four will go well together. Or this is the another one, analogic, and depending on which website you go, they'll have different versions of these. You have here three that go together with the accent that is the opposite color. So you have the red and then the green accent that we talked about before. So yeah, you don't have to pick colors randomly. You just have to pick one color and then pick, whether you're going to need two more or need three more. Click over there and they'll tell you what other colors go with the one you chose. You don't even have to think about it. And this is used in websites, right? So you see this website here uses the blue color, and the highlight is the green color, and you can see how it's used. So the website is mostly on the blue, using this blue, but the search box and the shopping cart, which is very important to a shopping website, are in the contrasting color. So the orange stands out against the blue. Here's another example of the Mint app using these 4 colors on the square or the tetrad. They're also, if you are not happy with those, you can visit, Color Lovers or similar websites. So this is just a website where people just post color palettes. And the nice thing about this one is they also put in, a theme to go with, and in traditional one, the forest landscape. So these remind you of a forest or mother's love. So you can then do a search if you're building, Mother's Day app. You can search for mother, and maybe you get this palette, and then you use that for your app. So check it out. That's called colorlovers.com. The colors have associations associated with them. So, red usually is fiery passion, blue relaxing, orange is energy, green is nature, or, with a black background, it becomes computers. Black, luxury limos, luxury. White, again, is peaceful, and then yellow cabs and royal purple. So these, as you can tell by the royal purple, that's more of a British thing. And so these color associations can vary across cultures. So something to be aware of when you're picking your colors. The 80-20 rule. So remember that 80% of the time the users are using 20% of the features of your app. So in fact, I would say, it's more like 90-10 for a lot of apps. So you want to optimize for the heavily used features. You want to make things that are used a lot, easy to get to, fast and simple to use, and put them there in this case, on the ribbon. Don't put them, down the menu, right? So this is what Microsoft Word does. Tries to bring in the most important or most often used things up here in your face, and then the other stuff goes in the drop-down menu, which hides away. There's the Aesthetic-Usability Effect that you should be aware of. So the HCI researchers have done research into this, and actually, if you ask a bunch of people which one is easier to use, this one or this one, this is not a real study, but something like this. People will tell you that the one on the left here is easier to use, even if they're both functionally equivalent. So they actually both work exactly the same. You just move up and down and you change your channel. But because it looks nicer, people think of it as easier to use, and that affects how much money they pay for it. So yeah, making a good app look good will help you get better reviews. People will think it's easier to use just because it looks good. So on the flip side of that, if people are complaining that your app is hard to use, maybe they're just telling you that it's ugly. Affordance. So you'll hear this word a lot in the design world. So an affordance is basically it means that the shape of the object, affords a particular use. So it means it sort of makes it obvious that that particular use is what you want to do. So standard example is the door handles you see here on the left. So this kind of door handle affords pulling, right? So you see that door there, that handle like that, you want to pull it. Similarly, on the other side, you have this flat panel. I can't pull the flat panel, right? But I can clearly, I just see it, I want to push it. So it affords pulling and pushing. This is other types of doors that, have similar affordances. You're going to push this door, and this one, you're going to pull. Legos, of course, with the little holes in them, you just, right away you want to put them together. Now, in the computer world, we simulate some of these things with, graphical effects, right? So this 3D effect that you see here with the buttons, that just affords the clicking on that. So a user sees that, and I know that it's a button that I'm going to press and something's going to happen. So I'm making it look like a real world button, like a physical button. It stands up, so I want to click it. And I know when I click it, something is going to happen right there. And if it doesn't, I'm going to be disappointed. Similarly, when the iPhone came out, people were not used to touching screens, right? So all the icons, as you know, they're exactly the same size as a finger touching it. So they really afford getting pressed, right? So you just see them, you're like, well, really, I should probably press that because that's just the perfect size. If they were bigger or smaller, you probably wouldn't think of it right away. Alignment, simple thing you can do with all your user interfaces is just align things. If you're using Android or iOS, Xcode or Android Studio, when you're doing the layouts, they give you these little red lines automatically and then telling you, hey, you should put these things in line, right? So people like things aligned. If things are not aligned, they feel a little bit off, right? And they just feel more cluttered and not as nice as they should be. Like, for example, this sentence here is not aligned with this one and this one, so it just feels weird. So in the web development world, we do alignment in columns, right? So we have the 12 column grid is what you'll see in Bootstrap, and in a lot of the CSS frameworks, it's basically just 12 columns, and things get aligned into 12 columns. The reason they are 12 columns is because that is the smallest number that is both a multiple of 3 and 4, or basically 2, 3, and 4. And so we need that. So if you want to, you can have 2 columns, or you can have a 3-column layout, or you can have 1/3, 2/3, or you can have 4 columns, which is another thing that people often want, or 50% and then 25%, 25%, which means 3 columns but in a 4-column layout. So chunking is this is something that our brain does, that people have noticed, is that we combine many units of information into a limited number of chunks, and we do this via spatial recognition. So when you look at this Amazon page, for example, you can see like all these things here are together. So your brain chunks these all into one. In this case, it's a book and its title and its price and etc. So you can see it's all one in my mind quickly because of the white space around it, right? So this white space means that these things get chunked together. And then at a higher level, maybe this whole row is chunked, and then this row, and then this top part. Similarly over here, this whole things get chunked together because of the different color title here. So we intuitively know, without even reading it, that these things, whatever they are, they all go together. They're all related, more than say this and that. A common fate. So if you're doing sort of animation, something, we tend to assume that things that move together are related. So, and this is like a tower, right? So you're seeing a radar of the various planes. So if you have 2 planes moving together in the same direction at the same speed, we assume that they are, together in some way. They're related. They're flying in formation for some reason. If you have a bunch of birds flying together, we assume they're related. They're together for some reason. So, and this is we're talking about movement if they're moving in the same direction and same speed. Confirmation, something that you definitely need to do in your app, is you want to prevent unintended actions by requiring verification. So basically, if the user is about to do something that has repercussions that cannot be undone, or has some other repercussions, then you might want to confirm, right? So are you sure you want to delete that file? Are you sure you want to submit that, etc.? So you've seen this, but maybe they've saved your life a couple times. So remember to put that in for your users. Constraint. So one way to avoid the user from entering bad data is to just make it impossible to enter bad data. And we can do that with all these new UI elements we have. So we have drop-down boxes and check boxes, right? So in a drop-down box, the only thing the user can do is pick one of these. So this limits how much information the user gives you, whereas in a text box, the user can enter anything, including emojis and weird ISO code characters. With these, you have a lot more control, similar with these slider bars. And for dates, we have calendar pickers nowadays that really help the user, quickly pick a date without entering bad dates, So whenever possible, try to limit the user's actions. We have some more new ones, like in the Google Smart Search. You've probably seen that if you go to Google or some other search engines. You start typing the search in English and it gives you a drop down there. So that is a nice mixture between the full text box that lets you type anything and the drop down which limits what the user can do. So think about that one. Control. So if you have different types of users, which is very common, like beginners and experts, you want to support both, you can do that by just basically having two user interfaces. So you can have somewhere in your app where the user can turn on expert mode. So you start in normal mode and then give the user the ability to turn in expert mode, and that shows them all these other options. So here's the Ubuntu install has an expert mode, and this is a router which has a basic setup. So in this tab here, I can just set up the basic information, and 90% of your users will only use this basic setup, but then you still have all these other things here and all these other things that are more advanced. And you can see, right, these are gray, black, right? They're hard to see, and that is for a reason, because they are for experts, and you're kind of telling the user, hey, you don't see this. This is for experts only. Don't even start looking here. Don't worry about it. So that's another way of limiting how much trouble your users can get to, and just try to move them to just the beginner side of your app. There are different types of errors that the user can make. Speaking of errors, user can have slips or mistakes. So slips are when the user just physically does something wrong, like he clicks on the wrong button, or you have attention problems where the user, especially on the phone, the user starts using your app, then some life happens, they go out, they come back, and then they've forgotten a little bit what was going on, so they might enter data in the wrong box or something. So you want to capture the user's attention at all time and focus him on what they're doing. So mistakes. The user can have a perception mistakes where they see the wrong thing, right? And this happens because when you're reading, our eyes don't actually read every word. Sometimes we just gloss over it and just make up based on the context of what the words up before and after are. So just be aware of that. The user can make the wrong decision if you have very complex problems. Users can make the wrong decision, so try to minimize the complexity of the app. And finally, just maybe the user just doesn't understand what's going on, lacks enough knowledge to make the correct decision, and you might have to remind them, this is the little eyes and the little question marks, as you see in some apps where the user can tap that in and get some reminders of what that is, and what is an NIT, what is a DNS, etc. The Fitt's law says that the time to move to a target is proportional to the distance to the target and inversely proportional to the target size, the time to move your mouse to a target. So this is talking about how far the user can move. So if I want to hit that target, the farther it is, the longer it's going to take, and the bigger it is, the faster I'm going to get there. This comes in handy just to remember that for when you're building apps for desktop, right? Where the user has to move the mouse a lot. The standard flexibility and usability trade-off tells us that if you want to build something very flexible, well, you're going to need a lot of user interface, a lot of buttons in this case. So you can do a lot of stuff, but it's going to be hard to use. People are going to get confused. Whereas if you eliminate all that flexibility, you have just a few buttons. It's kind of easy, very easy to use, but now you can no longer do some of these things over here. Or if you can, it becomes really, really complicated. There's like multi-step processes that you have to use. So, this is a standard problem for software. We already talked about how you can improve that by, hiding things from beginners versus expert users, so making that distinction. And for example, paint programs, some programs decide to be very simple, some programs decide to be very flexible and give the user everything. Forgiveness, you should always help people avoid errors and minimize the repercussions when they occur. So you should forgive the user for making mistakes. This basically means you should implement the undo function. Right? It can be a lot of work sometimes, but your users will love you for it, right? So there's different types of undoing. This is the time machine where I can go back in time, and things like, Git, for example, kind of the whole purpose is to go back to previous versions, or the ability to be able to go back to previous versions whenever you want and undo your mistakes as a programmer. So this is something we love as users, so we should provide it to your users. The Gutenberg diagram, so when you're building web pages, this is for kind of like reading text. This tells us that you have this primary optical area, so the user is going to focus on the top here, his eye is going to start here, and then move sort of in this direction down over here. This is, mostly here in the West, and I think in all cultures where reading goes this way, right? So that's how when you read, you start reading at the top left, go this way, and then end up down here. So this is why websites, have their logo here, because this is where users go first. They know this is where I'm going to expect the logo, this is where I'm going to expect in your phone. That's where the menu item is, because that's the first place people look, right? This is another strong area. Up here, this is where usually the login, logout button is, and some other important stuff, but not as visually important, right? And then usually ends up down here, where again typically a shopping website will put their buy button or buy now button, because that's where the user's eye will tend to end. So the user starts here, goes down this way, sees the pitch, and then buys. That's what they hope. So put the important stuff up here, also down here, and this is also another good area. Hick's law says the time to decide is proportional to the number of choices. So the more choices you give your user, the more the time they're going to spend deciding. This can be a problem, right? If you have many such things, people can get very tired because your app is so slow, it takes forever. When really the problem is that they're taking a long time making decisions. It's not that it took them forever, it took the app forever, it took them a long time to make a decision, but nonetheless, you know better, the way to fix it is just to give them a few decisions. So, like picking fonts, you probably know, there's so many of them. It can take forever to pick the font you want, or selecting avatars. If your goal is just to get the user to start playing the game, just give them a couple avatars and then start. You can always change that later and give them more options later. Hierarchy, this is something you know very much. You know and love trees, right? So it turns out everybody knows trees at an intuitive level. So people understand hierarchical things like this natively. So don't be afraid to use trees. People like them and understand how to use them, and you don't have to explain it. The hierarchy of needs. So this just gives you an ordering as to how things should be done. So the first thing people want from an app is that it works. So functionality should do the thing that it's supposed to do, right? And then after that, you want it to also do it reliably, right? So you want it to work and work every time, not just sometimes, right? And then comes usability. So at this point, I want it to be easy to use. Then some people, if I am a heavy user of the app, I might want to be able, have shortcuts, customizations, that kind of stuff, all these other extra features that make me a power user of your app. And finally, creativity. I want to just be happy using the app, or find it beautiful, or find it creative, or find it joyful to use. So this is also how we grade apps in this class, and this is how you should be building your app. The first thing you want to make sure is that your app works all the time, so this means no bugs, and is usable. And then, these other ones, if you can get them, then you can get a really, really good grade. But you should, you definitely need to have these three, and in that order. If the app doesn't work, that's very bad, right? So, and as you go doing your design and development, you should keep these priorities in mind. Highlighting, you know what that is. You can highlight things, and you pay attention to them. You can highlight by using different fonts, by color, or a background color change, like they're doing over here. Different ways to highlight things to try to draw people to them. But if you use too many highlights in one page, then you can just none of them will stand out, and it's not going to work as well. Icons. All your apps, or most of the apps, will have icons, and you should understand how to use them. The easiest ones for the users to understand are the similar ones, where the icon is the thing that they know and love. So the headphones, or the microphone, or the letter, right? Things that correspond to things in the real world. So those are obvious. Similarly, example ones are like, a pencil for writing. It's, it's not writing, but it's similar enough. You have also other symbolic ones then that have been so well established that, everybody should know that that's a music note, even though that is not actual music. And similar with logos, company logos like YouTube, after a while, then they get ingrained in people's brain, and people understand what that means. Finally, you have the arbitrary ones that, like the Wi-Fi logo here, that some consortium decided this is going to be the Wi-Fi logo, and then everybody used it. So by now, it's well understood. In the early days, of course, nobody knew what it was. And of course, similarly, new users, people who never used the computer, might not know what it is. So you got to keep that in mind. With arbitrary icons and also symbolic icons, you got to know your audience, and know what they know, and use your icons accordingly. The inverted pyramid, and if you're writing text for like a web app, remember the information that you present should be presented in descending order of importance. So your most important stuff goes first, then some more details, and then the general background information. So this is different if you're taking a writing class. You're writing a story. You don't want to start with the end, right? The punchline. You build it up, etc. Well, that's not it. This is more like writing a news article. If you're taking that kind of class, you'll know that the standard news writing is you start with the headline, and then the first sentence gives you just more details about that headline. And so forth, and then as you go on, it's just more and more not as important details. So you want your apps should be also in that way. So whenever you have a page in your app that has a lot of information, just try to put the important things at the top. Legibility, again, speaking of text, you want to make your text legible. So big enough type. The serif versus sans serif does not matter according to a lot of the research, in terms of legibility. This is for screen, so we're talking about computers and phones. And it doesn't really matter. Weird fonts can be problematic, however, and of course, Comic Sans is something that some people feel very strongly about, so you should know that. The contrast is the most important thing. So black and white, of course, provide the most constraint or contrast or something close to it, like gray on white, like we're using here. But yeah, no images in the background. Images, even if very, very light, will kind of make it harder to read. Justification, justified text versus left align doesn't matter much. And proportional text, though, it is better than monospace text, which we use as programmers. It is very, it's very good to have monospace text in your code editor, but not in a web page. People don't like it. Normal people don't like it. It's just hard to read. The mapping. So when you're doing your user interface, if you're doing a UI that sort of corresponds to a real world thing, you're going to try to mimic the position of your buttons and sliders and text boxes to that real world scenario. Kind of like this does, right? You have 4 burners and these 4 buttons. You obviously know which one maps to which. Whereas in this other one, it's not clear what this button does. Which one is it going to turn on, right? So yes, and we see this, real world physical controls are very good, have an intuitive mapping from, flight joystick to the actual plane and what's going to happen when you move it up and down, left or right. The plane is going to hopefully move up, down, left or right as you do. Occam's razor for UI design tells us that given the choice between 2 equally equivalent designs, functional equivalent designs, the simplest should be selected. Just in general, right? So you can see this is Google versus Bing. So Google followed Occam's razor. They picked sort of the simplest design. And Bing, on the other hand, decided to go in a different direction with a lot more complications. So generally, people are going to gravitate towards a simpler design. Of course, there is something to be said for pretty pictures. Operant conditioning, this is the idea that, we can reinforce a behavior on people. So if you reinforce a behavior on people, or in this case, a rat, so this is a little experiment where a rat pushes the lever. We want the rat to push the lever after the light goes on, and so we give him a little food. So if you keep giving him the food every time it pushes the little lever here, it will eat until it's full, and then when it's hungry again, it'll come back and get more food and stuff. But one of the things they found out with rats and people is that if you, instead of just having it work every time, if you do like what they call here variable ratio, so you just randomly give them food or not, when they press it, they can become addicted to pressing the paddle. And this, of course, happens in gambling. This is one reason why we can explain people getting addicted to gambling is the randomness of the payoff, right? So if every time you play the slot machine, it just, every time you put $1 in it, it just gave you 95 cents back, nobody would do that, right? But because sometimes it gives you $2 and sometimes it gives you $0, it gives you this high reward, and then you can't predict when it's going to happen. People become addicted, right? And this is the same type of mechanism that Farmville uses, and a lot of these online games use to get people addicted to them. And the same thing that you see in social media, where the social media feed is mostly boring until you get something that you like, and you're like, oh, this is great. And the unpredictability is what makes it addictive to some people, among other things. There are other factors in there, but it's that unpredictable reward. So rewards are good. Unpredictable rewards get your users addicted to your product. You can be good or you can be evil with that information. It's up to you. Performance versus preference. Sometimes users prefer that which is not optimal for them. So the Dvorak keyboard was proposed to replace the keyword to keyboard because it is faster, easier to type, etc. But people just didn't like it, right? So people were used to it. There was too much of a switching cost. So yeah, people are just sometimes going to prefer things that are not preferred, and that's fine. You just have to accept it. Progressive disclosure. So another way to handle if you have a complex app with a lot of features and you don't want to burden the user with all of them at once. So like Google has a very simple user interface here, but then after you do a first search, you go here, and then all of a sudden you have all these other choices you can make. I could have put these in the main page here, but they didn't. And this is an example of progressive disclosure, right? So they wait until after you tried something, and then they give you more choices. And if they could, I don't think they're doing it, but if they could, they might even, tell you which one, or try to guess as to which one of these you want to use. And in fact, sort of do that with the little boxes on the right side, like if you search for a direction here, they actually will show a little map over here, which is a map search. So yeah, it's a good technique. So you start with a simple UI and let the user do something, and then expose them to a more complex UI. Recognition over recall. So we're just better at recognizing things than just recalling it. So if you tell me the name of somebody I haven't heard of in a while, I might recognize the name. But if you ask me who that person was without telling me a name, I might be unable to recall the name, So when I see it, I know it, I remember it. We're all like that. So this is one big reason why graphical user interfaces have been so popular, is because they show us a lot of stuff. And the moment we see that menu item, oh, okay, I remember now. That's the one that I need. Well, as text interfaces, the old terminal doesn't show us anything until we type something. So I have to remember everything. I have to remember all the commands all the time and how they work, or, at least look it up. So whenever possible, if you want to make things easier for the user, just remember to show it to them. Yeah. When doing graphical design or putting stuff up, remember the rules of thirds. This is from photography or just visual arts. That you don't want to center your subject in the middle. You want to put them in this line or this line. So you divide your image into 3 parts, and then you put your subject in one of those, in the 1/3 or the 2/3 line. And it just looks more professional that way. The scaling fallacy. So if you do an Android and iOS app, they'll ask you for an icon. They'll ask you for the icon at multiple sizes. Now you can just you scale the one icon to all the sizes, but that actually doesn't work very well in general, because it doesn't work. Smaller things, you usually need to remove detail. So here's a good example of a microphone, how it might be in a very small scale, medium scale, and large scale. You see, the artist here just added a lot more detail to the microphone. We can still sort of say it's the same microphone, just at different scales. You can see that with a calendar icon here. This one is a little bit different. It's got July here, which that one doesn't have. It's got a little flip page here, barely has that there, etc. This is comes up all the time in mobile apps, because your icon can be used here, can be used in the menu, can be used in various places at different sizes, and you might want different icons for that. But also within your app, you might have an icon that you're using in different places, and just remember that you might want to use slightly different icons for that. Uniform connectedness says that connected elements are perceived to be more related than the rest. So if you connect two things, they're going to be related. Intuitive, right? So over here, you can see these two circles are really close to each other, more than these one and than these two here, which are connected, but yet obviously we see these as related. So this is one thing, this is another thing, this is another thing. Similarly for all these, even down here, these two things are one thing, even though they're different sizes and colors. And these two are exactly the same size and color. We don't see these two blue circles as one thing. We see this whole thing as one and this whole thing as one because of the line. So in terms of user interfaces, we use this little grouping line. A lot of UIs will have these little lines. Sometimes they're gray, sometimes they're very, almost invisible, and yet they're enough so the user can see them and, realize that these things are together. And as I showed early on, sometimes you can just use white space instead of a line to put things together.